Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
The United States and the Soviet Union have been in a Cold War or a state of political hostility between countries over a period of time. The rivalry between communism and democracy that was formed by the space race and the Bay of Pigs invasion, an assassination attempt by the United States on Cuban leader Fidel Castro, have worsened relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. Some of it was due to the Soviet Union having an alliance with Cuba. The turning point in the Cold War was the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is when the Soviet Union gave missiles to Cuba to possibly attack the United States. The Cuban Missile Crisis have worsened the U.S. relations with communist countries and was the closest the world has ever been to nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis started on October 16, 1962, after the United States confirmed that Soviet missiles were on Cuba after doing a U-2 mission over Cuba on October 14, 1962. The Soviet Union had threatened to put missiles on Cuba earlier to help against the Cuban threat. Another reason the Soviets put missiles in Cuba was due to the missiles aimed at the Soviets that were in Western Europe and Turkey. The United States had a hard decision to make. If they did anything too aggressive, the Soviets would get involved and they would go into war with one of the strongest armies in the world. Most likely that war would go global and nuclear. If they did anything too passive, the Cubans could attack the United States with missiles and it could possibly escalate the nuclear war. The situation was hard, but the United States had to think quickly or things could go very badly. The United States plan started on October 22nd when President John F. Kennedy made an overdramatic televised announcement saying that there were missiles in Cuba aimed at the United States and demanded that they were removed. He also called for an emergency meeting with the United States in Organization of American States. He also announced that any attack on the United States would be countered back at the Soviets, especially attacking the Berlin area. The Soviets responded on October 23, 1962, and said that President John F. Kennedy was pushing for nuclear war. The next day, the United States put a naval blockade on Cuba with naval forces. On October 26, Nikita Khrushchev wrote a letter to John F. Kennedy stating that the Soviets will remove the missiles that the United States promises not to invade Cuba. The same day, 2 American U-2s were shot down with Soviet weapons that just became operational. War was edging and was most likely in the foreseeable future.
We were allies. Now the war is over and they want to start gobbling things up, and we want to stop them from gobbling things up. It's called the Cold War. Everything, okay, they don't like us, we don't like them. We've developed a nuclear weapon that we dropped on the Japanese. The Soviet Union had spies, they saw what we did, they developed nuclear weapons. So both sides started developing nuclear weapons. And it was called mutually assured destruction. That means if you attack us, we're going to have so many bombs, we'll blow you up completely. And if we attack you, you'll blow us up. So what's the use of having a war? The Cold War is what it's called.
This is a huge turning point in the Cuban Missile Crisis. The United States and the Soviet Union already had a bad relationship, but this just made it worse. The missiles in Cuba just made that relationship worse and made the world brink of nuclear war. If the missiles went nuclear at all, it could be the start of World War III and the end of mankind. The longer this went on, the more likely it could escalate and go outside of the North American area. European countries would get involved due to their alliances with the United States, and more countries would join because of that. If the situation is not controlled fast, it will spiral out of control and be a definite global conflict. Gradually, this was getting out of hand, and Khrushchev was noticing. Even though he never acknowledged the missiles in Cuba and never openly said a war was brewing, he still stopped deliveries of the weapons to Cuba. Over the next 2 weeks, Kennedy and Khrushchev both decided to settle on a peaceful agreement to end this. The Soviets saw the missiles in Turkey as a threat toward them due to them being in range. They compared those to the missiles in Cuba toward the United States. Both parties agreed to take the missiles out of the respective countries they were in. The United States also agreed to not partake in another invasion into Cuba ever again.
During the entire negotiation, Fidel Castro never got a say in any of the negotiations. Castro saw this as humiliating and saw the Soviets prioritizing relations with the United States other than their own allies. Castro wanted the naval base at Guantanamo, which is in Cuba, closed, and wanted the hold of U-2 missions over Cuban territory. None of this happened, which didn't help Khrushchev. Khrushchev was forced into retirement because of how he handled the situation and how he led the country. He thought he made reckless decisions on how he handled the crisis and how he almost led to something that could have ended the world. When Khrushchev stepped down, his successor, Leonid Brezhnev, wanted to reduce tensions with the United States when he came into power.
I want to say, and this is very important, at the end, we lucked out. It was luck that prevented nuclear war. We came that close to nuclear war at the end. Rational individuals. Kennedy was rational. Khrushchev was rational. Castro was rational. Rational individuals came that close to total destruction of their societies. And that danger exists today.
So in summary, the conflict eventually ended on October 28, 1962, when a radio broadcast from Moscow, Russia, announced an effort to reduce tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States. The announcement also said officially that the Soviet Union would remove the missiles if the United States didn't invade Cuba. It was confirmed later by video surveillance that said the missile sites were dismantled and the missiles were removed. The world was safe from a nuclear war. After it ended, a hotline was made in Washington and Moscow to be able to communicate so another event like this never happens again. Both countries also made improvements in an international strategic environment and stopped competition in nuclear war. The Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed due to this, and that stated the halt of the spread of nuclear weapons to other countries. In contrast, both countries increased their research and funding into the technology and stock for militarized weapons.
Today, relations are still not the best with Cuba, but they are continuing to get better. People can now commercially fly and travel to Cuba. It has been since 2003 that people could travel to Cuba on commercial flights on airlines like American Airlines, Southwest, JetBlue, and more to come. The United States plans on removing Cuba from the state sponsor of terrorism list. This hurt them before because the United States will not trade as much and will make it more difficult for people to trade too. So now Cuba can trade more freely. The United States can now export and import supplies to Cuba now, but there are some restrictions. On the other hand, the United States' relationship with Russia has not gone any better in any recent memory. Recently, they've suspended participation in a new strategic arms reduction treaty. This means that the things trying to manage the risk of nuclear confrontation of the Cold War are going away, and they are needed most right now, due to wars in Europe like the Russian-Ukrainian war. If things go badly, then the whole world could get involved. The Cuban Missile Crisis still affects the United States today in its relationship with communist countries. Even though it happened 62 years ago, it still affects the world in some way today.
And self-discipline lie ahead, months in which both our patience and our will be tested, months in which many threats and denunciations will keep us aware of our dangers. But the greatest danger of all would be to do nothing. The path we have chosen for the present is full of hazards, as all paths are. But it is the one most consistent with our character and courage as a nation and our commitments around the world. The cost of freedom is always high, but Americans have always